I guess we're about ready to start.
No peace. Now we feel better.
Yeah.
Here we go. Hang on.
Excuse me.
So we're here to give a little bit of a history on railroad history in the Missoula area, and we have our distinguished publishers, Bill and Jan Taylor here, who have written several books on railroad history. And we have an experienced railroad engineer, Bob Bateman, who is a Milwaukee engineer to Burlington Northern to MRL. And we'll just start a little bit. We'll let Bob tell a few stories about Milwaukee history, and then we'll let Bill show his slides and give a little talk on the rest of it.
What kind of history?
Give a talk.
Just a talk.
You didn't say I had to give a talk.
You didn't tell me I had to give a talk.
He knows more about Milwaukee than I do.
But you were an engineer.
Oh yeah, the only thing that saved us is Alan Burns and Jim Young. We didn't have to steer.
Well, that's... You said the other day you'd tell a story or two about Milwaukee, and then...
You want stories? Just stories?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other than just running the engines, stuff like that? Now, let's see. The very first time I made a student trip in Three Forks in 1972, the engineer's name was Julian DeGidio. And the very first time I'd ever been on a Little Joe electric engine. That was pretty cool being a rail fan guy. And I was, 23 years old. I climbed up on that engine and introduced myself and sat down over in the fireman's seat against the window and opened up and was looking out. And he jumped on me like I was a 5-year-old kid. He chewed me out something horrible for sitting in that fireman's seat. Because I wasn't a fireman yet, I had to sit in the middle seat where the brakeman sat. So for the next 7 years, Julian DeGidio and I, we didn't get along very well. He didn't like me. Now, there's a lot of, we had a lot of fun on the Milwaukee. It was a little bit easier working, even though the track was getting bad and it was deteriorating. The people there were great. I mean, you just like a big family, everybody. And we had some incidents. Being a trainee, I sort of hit the box cab electric helpers into the train at Piedmont a little hard and broke the water bottle on the engine, and the engineer, his name was Red Pryor, he was in the substation and letting me do my own thing, and well, I messed it up big time. He comes screaming up in that engine and he was just laying into me. Well, there was a fireman on that job. What was his name, Jimmy? Del Hart. And he was restricted. He couldn't work the main line. He had a big wreck in 16 Mile Canyon. Yeah, he couldn't work as an engineer. He was a fireman on the switch engine at Butte or the helpers at Butte. And he was sitting in the back and the rear unit and watched me make this hard joint on the train. And of course, when I made the joint, the gallon water jug tipped over, broke all over the floor, glass, and that Red Pryor come up there, and he was sort of heavy set, and he was bald, and he was already had a red complexion and stuff. Man, he was mad. Oh, he said, I worked here for 25 years and I've never made a joint that hard. He's probably broke every frame on all of these engines. And so then Red Pryor, or not Red Pryor, but Del Hart, he came up, he was standing in the cab, and he looked around and he had a handlebar mustache. And he was just standing there twisting his handlebar mustache. And Red Pryor just jumped on him, horrible. But then, because he didn't dump the air and stop the engine so I wouldn't hit that train so hard, And but then after he got all settled down, he went back to the second unit and let me run the box cabs up the hill as a helper. So that was the first time I got to run the engines by myself. Kinda, up there.
You remember what Del Hart's nickname was?
Spook.
There you go.
I don't know why they called him
Well,
Spook.
he was kind of quiet, and he was always kind of slipping around the engine, and he'd sneak up behind you a lot of times.
Yeah, he was like I remember that now. He just would sneak around sorta. Yeah. Uncle Willie, he was a rock hound. He had a rock shop on the east side of the Pipestone Pass about halfway down the canyon towards Whitehall. He had all kinds of stuff in there, and that's all gone now. When he passed away, I don't know, it's just the building isn't there or anything. So, yeah. There's a lot of stories like that. I worked for, Jim and I were just talking, I worked for an engineer, Hayden Levesque, and he'd been there a long, long time. Huh?
Old Frenchman.
Yeah. And he had a heart attack in Harleton. We were laying over in Harlow, and I was a fireman for an engineer named Hank Rowe. And they called me in the middle of the night and took me off my firing turn and set me up as engineer on his job back to Three Forks. And so I had to work that job. And then when he came back to work a couple months later, they wouldn't let him come back to work unless he had someone in the cab with him, a fireman. It had to be a qualified engineer. So they assigned me to him because I was the youngest fireman at Three Forks. And he was kind of cranky. I guess maybe I got kind of, it's where you learn your crankiness, I guess. But he was kind of cranky. And so we got along okay. Well, one night, this is the weirdest thing in 35 years that ever happened to me on the railroad. He always had a thermos with a cup of coffee like everyone did. And a little bit before this, I'll say that in his grip, he carried a hammer, just a little hammer. And on the Milwaukee, we got what we call initial terminal delay. When you went to work, say at noon, and let's say you left at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, you got paid for that hour. And then you got paid for your, whatever the miles were for your regular trip. So he had this hammer, and just when you were getting ready to go, and you were supposed to pull out, he would get down off the engine, take his little hammer, and he would hit every sander, every sanding pipe on every engine. He figured that made an extra $2,000-3,000 for him a year in initial terminal delay. So now to get back, we were leaving Harlow 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning on a Little Joe, and Diesel's behind. And like I said, he had the habit of open his thermos, cup of coffee, just like engineers do. You put it on the controller. On a Joe, it's kind of weird, but you set it up there, and his thermos in his grip. So he did that a couple times, and we're on our way up towards Loweth and coming down into Ringling. And he gets out, he pours a cup of coffee, turns his light on, pours a cup of coffee, puts the lid on it, opens the window, and throws it out. Throws his thermos out the window. You know, and I'm at that, you know, I'm 24 by now, or 25, you know, and you're scared of these guys. You know, these guys are old heads. So you closed the window and turned his light off, and I didn't say anything. Not one word. Boy, I'll tell you, I didn't say anything. So we went, you know, half an hour, 40 minutes later, he goes to get another cup of coffee, so he turns on his light, he reaches down and he can't find his thermos. So he's rummaging around and he looks over at me and he says, Bateman, he says, where, you see my thermos? You know, it's one of those times in your life, you know, you don't want to say anything. You don't want to say anything. So I told him, Hayden, I says, last time you poured your cup of coffee, I said, you threw it out the window. And he looked at me like I was just plumb insane, you know? I mean, so he looked down again, he looked and looked, and he couldn't find it. So finally, he must have realized, or I guess he realized that he had done that. So he turned his light off, and so we were going along. Pretty soon, he turned his light on again. He reaches in his grip, and he gets that little hammer, and he beat the inside of that little Joe to death. He broke every glass in all the gauges. He hit the windows. He hit the top of the roof. He just threw a temper tantrum that you just was beyond belief. Put this hammer back in and turned his light off and never said another word all the way to Three Forks. You know, that was the weirdest thing that ever happened to me in all those years when he threw his thermos.
That's the only way in the words of Hayden's got a story like that.
Oh yeah, he was, you know, there's
Crazy, wild-eyed old friend.
this gentleman I'm talking to, his Jim Yunkin, he was a brakeman engineer, and he's been a railroader just as long as I have. And he's got a better memory than I do, but they were on a work train out of Butte. And the Milwaukee only had a couple of cupola cabooses. They were all bay windows. And I had a brakeman working with me, and I was the engineer on an eastbound with brand new diesels, brand new SD 40-2s. They just stunk like a new car, you know, 1973. They were brand new. So we're dragging up the hill. We're not going very fast, of course, and I can see him up there. He was standing up on top of that caboose with a big bowl of water. It's August, it's hot. You're running with your window open. Well, he was going to soak me when we went by. He was going to throw that thing of water in the cab and soak me. Well, the fireman or the brakeman that had been working with me had been bugging me the whole trip. He wanted to run the engine. His name was Gordon Lane. Well, you could see this coming, you know. So I told him, Gordon, I says, you know, why don't you take her? I says, we're not doing anything, we're just dragging along. Use the sander when you want to and blow at the crossings and stuff. So I went over there and sat over there kind of in the two seats on the engine. There's the brakeman's and the fireman's and then the engineer. And so I sat up in the front, right next to the window, because I knew when that water come flying through, it'd sort of, you know, go cockeyed through the cab. Well, so we're dragging by there. He pops out, and he just soaked him. I mean, he just soaked him. And he turned to me, and he knew right away then what I'd done to him. But there was so much water in there, that controller of that diesel was just soaked. You'd have thought that we'd have blown fuses or the thing that went to ground or something, you know. But, yeah, there's a lot of stories like that. And most of them I remember on the Milwaukee. There was a lot of BN stories also. But you just wanted Milwaukee stuff?
Anything, your career, you got an exceptional career.
Some folks around here might remember the Quinlan family. I know Uncle Willie does. Quinlan, Barney Quinlan and his folks, they had the Dewdrop Inn down here, the restaurant down here in West Riverside. And he, when I came to Missoula, he kind of took a liking to me because years ago he had dated my Aunt Louise, my Uncle Willie's older sister. And so he kind of liked me, but he was always doing stuff to me. He was a big man. I mean, his hands, you put your hand up there, a normal person, I mean, his hands were just big. So a couple times over the years that I worked for him, most of the time on the Polson local, to Polson and back from Missoula. And I'd have a new pair of gloves. Well, he'd grab those gloves and he'd put them on. Well, then these are pretty nice gloves, Bateman. He'd say, and he'd go like that. Well, then they're a whole size too big. You know, he did that to me a couple times. So once it's summer, so we're switching around Polson, and I was the fireman, the brakeman. You'd get out there and you'd help him. You know, help stand and throw a switch for him or something, so they wouldn't have to walk so far and things. So I told Barney that day that I forgot my gloves. Can I borrow his gloves? This is really cool. He liked it. Anyway, so we're switching out there, and so I got on the fireman's side of the engine opposite where he was, and I laid his gloves on the track on the rail and let the engine run over him about 2 or 3 times. Cut all the fingers off like this, you know. So then we got all done, and I get up there and I says, "Here's your gloves back." And he looked at those, and he put them on, you know, and it's just like you motorcycle gloves or something. There were no fingers left in them, you know. So I got yelled at for that. And I know he sat there one time. I was coming down out of Evero into Missoula on the local again. I was running, and I see Mr. Glenn Hovey's here. He was the road foreman of engines at that time, so I probably shouldn't be telling these stories, but yeah, he's retired. He Barney was sitting in the fireman's seat over there reading the paper. He was sitting like this, and so I'm running the engine. The brakeman's sitting here. No, the brakeman, he would be in the second, third unit. So just 2 of us up there. So in your grip, you always sort of carried, you know, you carried Band-Aids and matches, just a little tiny first aid kit thing. And and why he didn't smell the sulfur, I'll never know. But he's sitting there with the paper like this. So I struck that match and hit the bottom of that paper, and you'd think that paper was soaked in gasoline. It just went woof like that, and here you're sitting there holding the 2 sides of the paper with, you know, smoke and ashes going everywhere, and I got yelled at for that one. So, let's see, BN one. Let's see, coming into Bonner on the Bonner local. Gary Larson, he's retired now too. He's been here a long time. I think it was his grandpa, Fred Larson, ran the number 5 and the number 7 here. I got a newspaper article on him. He was telling me about that here at the mill and up in the woods. So I was the fireman, he was the engineer. 2 times I got him really good. Going across the bridge right here, when you come underneath the freeway, you know how that is. You got the trestle and then the Harold's Club crossing and then the switch to go up to the mill. Just as we come across the curve, and at that time, before MRL, the switches were 12 miles an hour. Now they're 30. But, you know, you go in there 12, 15 miles an hour, and then you got to set the air about the time you get to the bridge, because you got a whole bunch of logs behind you and empty chip cars and pretty good little train for a local. So just before he goes to set the air, I'd taken in my grip extra handles. So just before he gets there, I reach over and I grab the independent, which is the engine brakes, and I grab the automatic, and I put them over to their neutral, took them off, and threw them in the river. Right through that. They're still out there. As soon as we get permission to people to float or whatever, I'm gonna, because now the river's only that deep there, I'm gonna go wading out there, see if I can find those handles, and take him back to him. So, of course, I got yelled for that. And he just waited till he sort of got close to the switch, you know, and then dumps the air so we could get stopped. But I had extra handles in my grip, so I gave him new ones. And he still remembers that. And if a lot of you remember Harold's Club, there used to be a restaurant there. They had hamburgers. And I don't know, they still have chicken or stuff like that. They had hamburgers. So we're switching the mill, and I can't remember what the grade is down there. Was it 3 or 4% coming down in there, down into the plywood? Pretty steep in there, and you had to kind of get a hold of them to make your spot and make sure you didn't hit the end of the building, which happened one time. A boxcar kind of went through, and people sitting at their desks, and the boxcar goes through there. So we were talking about getting some lunch. I was running the engine. He's sitting over there, so we started down, and I think you could put 8 or 12 cars or something there in that shed. So I said, well, I'm going to go get some hamburgers. So I just got up out of the seat and went out the back door. And he looked over, and there's nobody running the engine, and we're going down into the thing. And I went over, I waved at him, and was over, got some hamburgers. And then when I got back, I got yelled for that. But there's a lot of things, you know, he did a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of engineers and stuff that did a lot of stuff to me too. And I'm sure Mr. Yunkin and Alan Burns, he's sitting back there, he's an engineer. And Mr. Hovey is an old-time engineer, Missoula Road Foreman Engines. And there's just a lot of stories like that. Other than just getting on, it's a lot of hard work. It's a lifestyle that you either want to do or you don't want to do. You're gone all the time. You sit down to Thanksgiving dinner, Christmas dinner, and the phone rings and you're gone. You think you're going to be home and you're gone. You think you're going to go to work at 5 in the evening, you go to work at midnight or just turn it around, you know, something like that. So it's a lifestyle that's different. So you had to sort of make your own fun. I'll just say one more and then I'll give it to Bill. This one here is kind of good too. This was done to me. The two of them. In Milwaukee, this Red Pryor, he smoked big cigars. And we're coming down the middle of down off Pipestone Pass, coming into Whitehall and Piedmont in the middle of the night. And he's sitting over there, of course, being against the rules, you know, he's sitting over there sleeping. I'm running. And that cigar just stunk. And I'd complained to him about it. And he said if I didn't like it, I'd go sit outside. You know, because these guys, you know, they were old head Milwaukee guys. You didn't really mess with them. And so I noticed over there he was snoring away. He was sound asleep, which you're not supposed to be doing, by the way, so don't remember any of this. Anyway, but that cigar was just, it was killing me. Well, what he'd done, he smoked it down about that far, and then unbeknownst to me, he flipped it underneath my seat. So it's just smoldering there while he's asleep. So another time, one more story I'll tell you. Coming down on the local with two Burlington Northern GP9s. We had them switch engines, road switchers, coming down out of Garrison. And it was the 4th of July, within a couple of days. We only had a couple of 3 cars. And of course, that time you had cabooses. And there was the rear brakeman. This guy's name is Ron Stickney. He's now a retired engineer from MRL too. And he was the rear brakeman at that time. So we're coming in to Piltsville, into Milltown, and all of a sudden I see this go by my window. And then pretty soon there's another one. And I couldn't figure out, what in the heck is that? He was shooting bottle rockets from the caboose, and they were going faster than we were. And I don't know why, but I mean, they were going, the 3 cars, the 2 engine lights, they were going right by my window, you know, bottle rockets, you know, so, and he thought that was really cool too. So. But I mean, but like I say, there's a lot of stories. It wasn't just a lot of work, which it was, and a lot of headaches a lot of times, but a lot of fun too. So there's 100 more stories I could tell, but Bill, he's getting anxious. So besides,
turn over to Mr. Taylor now. Then.
Besides, I have a cold. What?
Yeah. Stories of bottle rockets. Well, I'm not a railroader. I have no particular connections to Bonner. I've lived in Missoula since 1964, but I'm a Helena boy. But I did marry a girl who had connections to Bonner. My wife Jan, sitting back there in the green and blue vest, and her family worked at the mill here before World War II, and then when the war broke out, her dad enlisted in the Marines, came home on a 2-week furlough, met her mother, who was taking tickets to Wilma Theater, and they got married, and they lived very happily for quite a number of years and produced a daughter. In fact, her uncle, I think his name is on one of those beams over here in the old plant. So she has connections, so if you want to know about mill relevance, she's the one to talk about rather than me. Dennis, in his persuasive way, asked me to participate in this, and you may or may not know, Jan and I are rail historians. We've published some books on railroads in Montana, but nothing specific about Bonner.
But I did go through, I've been a photo collector for most of my life, and I keep probably somewhere around 6,000 photos in a collection that's pertains to railroading in the state. Only if somebody will buy them.
I don't think you could do that.
Only if someone will buy them can we sell them. So anyway, I went to my collection and I came up with all of the Bonner relevant photos I could come up with for this, and there's only 26 of them, so don't be alarmed. And any stories I tell may or may not be true. That's all I'll say about that. So without any other prologue, let's get going here. My rail connection, I'm a retired school teacher. I worked 35 years in Montana's secondary schools. I came out of college with 2 degrees, one in history, one in English. I worked the English my whole life, and history's always been kind of my hobby. And that evolved through a long, complicated set of circumstances into rail histories. Won't bore you with all the details. My railroad connections, well, I worked on a passenger train for 4 years. It's a picture of us there, and I own my own little speeder, and we do about 2,000 miles a year on railroad tracks, a lot of here in Montana. I get a lot of enjoyment out of looking at engineering and asking myself why the railroad went here and seeing what evidence that you can of that. I never know, when I talk to a group, how much you know about the railroads locally. And this, I always try to tailor these things to be very local. Pardon the pun on tailor. You got laughs. I didn't get laughs. But anyway, here's a quick review of the railroads that came through Bonner over its history. And then we'll move specifically to the NP, the first one. And as I was looting my photo collection, I came up with something. How many people know that NP went on 3 different routes between here and Missoula? A lot of people don't know that. When the railroad was built in 1883, it crossed the river right here, coming in from Bonner. And then it pretty much followed the loop around that the road does today across Bandman Flats. And then it crossed over into what would become East Missoula over here, just about the end of Speedway, just above the Bandman Bridge. Used to be you could see the old bridge abutments and things there, but I think there's been so much development in there the last few years that there's very little evidence of it left. That lasted from 1883 till 1888, and then rather than rebuild the wooden bridges, the NP moved their line around onto Marshall Grade, which is where the old highway goes today. That lasted until 1908, but Marshall Grade did then what it does now. It sloughs rock pretty bad, and I'll show you a picture of that in just a minute. And so in 1908, during another big remodel of the NP, when they made it into a double track main line and made room for the Milwaukee on the same grade, they moved it back over on Bandman Flats, where MRL still is today. This is a 1937 aerial photograph from the U.S. Forest Service showing Bandman Flats. Bonner's over here, Missoula's over there. This is Marshall Grade. And you can see that old grade across Bandman here. And again, that's roughly the route of the road that's there these days. And then, of course, at that time, the highway was using the grade on Marshall Grade. And then you can see the new NP line down there.
Yes, the golf course, Canyon River, put the black tee on, I think it's number 5.
Oh, really?
On the eastern approach, right there by the river, of that 1883 bridge, so it's still there.
The last time I looked here, there was a house built right on it. On the Bonner side, yes, on the east side. And over here, there's a whole line of Canyon Village housing in there now that's pretty much eradicated that. And I haven't checked out to see what's happened there, but I know you can still see down here closer to the new main line
There's a power line runs right along the old grade there, and you can still see some of the old black cinder ballast along there, which was both used in 1883 and in 1888 when they moved over to Marshall.
And the streetcar used the grade north of the river.
That is correct. Mac points out the streetcar used the grade, Marshall grade, until 1932.
January 28th.
Did the Milwaukee pay for that move over?
The question is, did the Milwaukee pay for the move? When the Milwaukee and the NP rebuilt out through the thing here, they had a 2/3, 1/3 arrangement. So where you see those double tunnels or the big cuts, the Milwaukee would pay 1/3 of that, the NP would pay 2/3 on the idea that the NP was a double track and the Milwaukee was a one track.
I always wondered if, because they moved their bridge right there and the Milwaukee was coming at the same time, if they sort of finagled the Milwaukee to say, if you want to come through here, then you need to pay for this bridge.
I don't know that. Yeah, I don't know that for sure, Bob. I do know that the NP prior to the Milwaukee, to the 1908 rebuild, wound around the canyon, avoiding tunnels and crossings of the river. The Milwaukee, to build through there, would have had to cross grade several times, which is not something you want to do on a mainline railroad. And so the Milwaukee's coming was a big impetus to shorten that up. And they shortened this line between here and Drummond by almost 3 miles when they did the double track and went through hills instead of going around them. So it was a big thing. A lot of people don't know Winston Brothers contracting firms built both grades. They had the contract for both. They brought supplies out on the NP and built Milwaukee coincidentally. When the big 1908 flood hit and washed everything out between here and Drummond, it was decided that it was easier to build the NP first to get supplies through, which they did. They left the Milwaukee pretty much washed out until later that year, and that's why the Milwaukee's last spike ceremony doesn't happen until the following year, because they were getting to Missoula. I'll show you a picture of that in just a minute. But they got here via the NP. They came in on trackage rights from Garrison on the NP into Missoula until May of 1909. So the reason for that is a legal court case that happened way back. The Supreme Court decided that one railroad couldn't show a greater need for terrain than another, and so they had to share. And that meant you even had to give them trackage rights if they needed it. Pictures out there on Bandman are few and far between. This one's kind of interesting up here. It started out as a photograph, and then it's been heavily retouched by artists, as was the style those days. This is Bonner, and this is a train on the Marshall grade line, pretty much where the highway is. But then there's this one over here, which is kind of interesting. Not at all where the first NP line went across Bandman. But what it tells me is the artist had some lingering knowledge that it once did, and so he penciled it in. Never went that close to the river. This one here is 1890. Train hit a rock at Marshall grade. That's the entrance to Marshall Canyon right there. There sits the engine and the rest of the train. And it's interesting to look at this photograph in some detail because all those people are out just for a Sunday lark looking at this destroyed train out there at Marshall grade. And then this is a picture taken from the top of Marshall grade looking towards East Missoula, Brickyard Hill up there with a train coming along the river here. Bateman, isn't that about where you live right there? Bob and I went swimming in the river one time. I got to tell a story. Years ago, we'd seen this photograph and we decided we'd go swim in the Clark Fork to see what we could find. I mean, who knows? Maybe there's an engine bell down there or a headlight or heaven only knows what. I think all we found was a few old suckers and some rusty brake rigging, but it was a fun day. This is a 1909 Northern Pacific yard plat. The occasion for this was the realignment of their main. So this is 1909, and they're building the new bridge across the Blackfoot, which is the same one MRO used today. But here's the old grade that was headed off for Marshall grade. And the old railroad bridge crossed the river right where the highway bridge does now. In fact, until they built this last bridge, you could see some evidence of the old railroad bridge supports underneath it when the water was low. And so these tracks up here, which they're calling the High Line, are still there. That's those two tracks that are just across the street over here that MRL used to use BN used to use for some storage. And then you can see the Y track that went from there into the mill. It shows where the depot was located originally inside the lakes of the Y, and that's this depot, which still exists. And then it got moved down east, where we all remember it, right over here, where the orange caboose is today. And then it got moved again across the tracks and is a private storehouse now. If we look at Bonner Mill sometime in the same time, 1909, it's nowhere near as large as it was going to be a lot later, but the dam's in place. This might explain why all those sunken logs are out here when they removed the dam. But it had a partner. A lot of people don't realize that there was another big Blackfoot mill at St. Regis, which sat on a peninsula in the river. Kind of hard to see, down behind where Tricon Lumber is now, a little bit to the east of that. And it was every bit as big as Bonner. This is the St. Regis mill. A couple of views of that, looking out onto, this is that peninsula. The river's actually wrapping around behind the photographer here. When the Milwaukee came, there was an interesting corporate connection between the Milwaukee Road and the ACM company. Daly was dead by this time. Amalgamated Copper had gotten a hold of most of the mining properties in Butte, including the timberlands, and it was being operated as a huge industrial incorporation. And one of the major officers was a guy by the name of Rockefeller, not the same guy with Standard Oil, but similar. And he was head of the Milwaukee, and they became corporate cousins, so to speak. And so when the Milwaukee built through, there was a lot of motivation for them to build to these two mills, to service the mills rather than the NP. And so at St. Regis, the Milwaukee built a 4-mile stub off the main line, crossing the Clark Fork on a 4-tier bridge to get into the St. Regis mill. And then they did the same thing here at Bonner to reach into this mill. And most of the switching operations at both mills were given over to the Milwaukee until the Milwaukee folded. They also ran their own timberlands, logging railroads. And this is where I get into trouble because I haven't done a lot of research into logging railroads. So there's probably people in this room that know a whole lot more about what they're looking at than I do. But just a sampler here. This is a picture taken, I think, somewhere near Woodworth, which is up here in the upper reaches of the Blackfoot.
No.
Not?
McNamara's Landing.
McNamara's Landing. Okay, see, I told you. So where's the river?
Behind the tree.
Okay. Has to be after 1913 because that's a Milwaukee caboose, and tracks didn't reach up that far until after 1913. Out at Trout Creek, western Montana, ACM also had timber holdings. Dennis tells me this is actually not an ACM engine, it's probably Western Lumber, but ACM had similar operations out there around Trout Creek, Montana. They ran up the 9-mile, interchanged with the Milwaukee at Sudan. There's number 2, working up the 9-mile, hauling logs out. And then this one I just couldn't resist. This is years ago. I heard this story. Might have been from you. I heard this story about if you put on scuba tanks and you dive down in the lower reaches of Seeley Lake, there's an old Shea locomotive sitting on the bottom down there. I've heard similar stories 10 zillion times, and I've yet to find any of these locomotives. And believe me, I've looked. But what they did do is they would haul this shay in there for the season. I believe this was probably Stoltz out of Columbia Falls that was doing this, and work up there, and then in the winter, sometimes they would build track out across the ice to get it back out again. And this is the only evidence I've really ever found of that effort up there. Can you imagine the labor of putting that shay locomotive onto a barge in those days and towing it across Seeley Lake? I have a friend who is a scuba diver who scuba dived out there in the bay of Swan Lake, and he tells me that what is out there are piles of garbage, because apparently in the good old days, in the wintertime, people would take their garbage out there and stack it up, and then when the ice went out, it just went away. If we look at the Blackfoot up here, which is what we're most interested in here in Missoula, pictures up there are hard to find, I find. I probably have maybe a dozen. Most of them are much newer era, and almost none of Big Blackfoot Railroad, which was centered out of Potomac. But here's a couple. This comes out of Darla Hand's collection. This might even be her swimming up at McNamara's Landing, looking downriver where the highway bridge crosses now. And here's the old wooden trestle, which after when the Milwaukee built up the Blackfoot, they built a connection with Big Blackfoot to get across the river. This is looking at it the other way in a very bad photograph, but it's the only ones I've ever seen of that connection up there at McNamara's Landing. The highway is here now. You can still see these two old wagon road abutments in the river up there, which kind of locates you to this photograph. And then here's a picture much later. This is a McKay photograph, probably in the 20s, of the Blackfoot branch at McNamara's Landing, and there's a loading platform right there, which I found interesting, probably taken from these cliffs. And then this is over near probably to Elk Creek of CM and STP is what is penciled on here. Looks like it's probably number 7 up there with a set of log flats and an old loader up there. If anybody knows more about these things, please chime in, because I frankly don't. Slide-ass loader. I was going to say that, but you know.
At the upper picture with the kids up in the very left-hand corner, I have that pic. You can see the crane boom of Milwaukee crane sticking out through the trees on that one.
I've looked at that too, Dennis. My thoughts is they're tearing it down, because that bridge is in pretty tough shape. So it must have been right at the end of service.
1916 is when the company left Potomac.
Okay. Yeah, you have to see a better rendering of it. But anyway, they're rare pictures. Coming back to Bonner, between Clark and building the Milltown Dam and the Milwaukee Road, that river's been remodeled a lot out there. I always get kind of a chuckle when the EPA talks about putting it back into its original condition. Like anybody knows what in the heck that is, because I have yet to see a photograph taken out there from before the dam. Has anybody else ever seen a photograph out there? So I think it's somebody's imagination what that river is supposed to look like. But be that as it may. Clark built the dam in 1908 to provide electric power for his Western Lumber Company, which was over here across the Blackfoot. And this has always been an odd tunnel. This is the Milwaukee Road. And if you look at the portal to this very day, it says tunnel 16 and a half, 16.5. Now the Milwaukee numbered their tunnels all the way from Chicago to the West Coast consecutively. Tunnel 1 is in Wisconsin. Tunnel 2 is in Montana. Let you know what North Dakota's like, doesn't it? This is tunnel 16.5, and that tells me that when they were building out here, they didn't intend to put a tunnel there. There is no other half tunnel anywhere on the system. And so between the 1908 flood, which really put a volume of water through there and played havoc with that dam, as well as that cliff face. If you go out and look at that cliff face today, it looks a lot different than that photograph. The Milwaukee at some point decided to scrap their grade, which went out around the face, and instead go through it in tunnel 16.5. Here's another view of it down here after it's finished, and this is a picture I took of the east portal of it in 1980. Here's a couple pictures of the Milwaukee building into Missoula in 1909. This is after the big flood. By this time, you can see the work train building to the tunnel. Tunnel's under construction there. They've got a little dinky and some dollies in there hauling material out of there, using it for fill. Before EPA remediated that, there used to be that big fill through there with a little turtle pond behind it where kids used to go swimming. And the grade initially went out around the cliff face, Milltown Dam being off to the right. This is a picture here of the Milwaukee steel layers coming into Missoula. This was in March of 1909 when they arrived in town. And come to find out, there was a last spike celebration when they arrived in Missoula in March of 1909. It was quite a deal. Kim Brigham's newspaper featured the story of driving the last spike and so forth. The problem is they didn't get into Missoula on their own rails yet. The flood had washed out their grade, and they were switching over to the MP this side of Garrison and coming in on the NP until they got out here to Clinton, and then they switched back onto their own rails to get in this far. The Milwaukee access to Bonner was at Bonner Junction. Here's Bonner Junction at the west switch. This track went down and formed what we call a Y track, which led out here onto, where does this Duck Bridge come from? I keep hearing about Duck Bridge, which is the old Milwaukee Bridge, right? Where does that come from?
I think it was the cutoff. It was a duck refuge down here. You could shoot ducks on the dam side and split up.
Okay. Where did Duck Bridge come from? Why is it called Duck Bridge?
Well, it was partially covered bridge. And years ago when I was trapping, I'd go down through there along in the morning, and the kids would be lined up there at the Duck Bridge. And one of them would say, well, are you going to run your traps down there in the reserve? And, yeah. Well, I'd go underneath the bridge and start down through there. And there'd be ducks all over heck down in there. Well, going through there with a boat and everything, I'd start spooking them ducks out. And them kids would be lined up along the railroad track up there by the bridge. Pretty soon you'd hear bang, bang, pop, 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 pop. Them kids waiting for... One of them would yell, duck. Yeah. I'd go through there and start spooking them ducks out. Well, they'd circle around and start going upriver. And them kids would start letting go on them ducks up there. So that was the Duck Bridge.
Thank you. Now I know where Duck Bridge comes from. I always called it the Milwaukee Bonner Bridge, but you know, what the heck. When I was out there, everything on that bridge was shot full of holes. So I was a little suspicious that duck came from, watch out, we're shooting. And then, of course, during the 30s, when there was a big campaign to eliminate the odd-grade crossings with highways, they built this underpass out there to get up to Clearwater Yard here in Bonner, which it pretty much marks the end of track after the remediation project. These are pictures I took in 1980 when the railroad was being scrapped out. This is another one of those 1937 aerial views of Bonner, and I had to kind of, I think the airplane was flying upside down or something when he took this photo. He must have had turbulence out there. But just to orient you, here's the Milwaukee grade coming through, and there's the dam, and tunnel 16.5, and here's the Bonner Y. There were people that lived there. That was the little town of Bonner Junction. There's still people over there in some of those old section houses. This is the bridge going across the river and up underneath the highway into Clearwater Yard. which the Milwaukee used to switch the mill and also to go upriver. And then there's the track, just the beginnings of the track here, which MRL still uses this day to reach into the mill. And then the Milwaukee crossed over the river and went up the other side on its journey up the Big Blackfoot. Much bigger place in 1937 than the last picture we saw in 1909. Bob was talking about his experiences on a Little Joe. In 1916, the Milwaukee put in an overhead electrical system to run electric engines, and that's a whole different story. And most people who think about the Milwaukee think of it as an electric-powered railroad, but the truth is, branch lines, including the Blackfoot, were steam-powered. There was no electricity that reached into there at all. And they would run a local out of Missoula throughout most of its history. Here's the local coming back into Missoula. They'd come out to Bonner and switch Clearwater Yard and whatever other work they had to do at the mill, and then they'd come back to town. Here's another picture of a similar lash up. I'm thinking that's probably at the unloading tracks over here with the river behind it. And then across the river was the big unloading area here, where they would dump logs into the river after they quit floating them down the river. And again, this is an explanation of why all those sunken logs are out there to this very day. I was appalled when I read the number of logs that they found out there buried in that sand. You'd have thought it would have been worthwhile for ACM to go out there and recover them at some point, but apparently not. The big event, of course, I guess, is Timberjack. We all know about Timberjack, and Dennis and the group have made a DVD version of it, which is great. It's horribly corny, but it does have some great shots of our area, as well as Polson, and of the steam engines running. But years ago, I was in Spokane in a junk store, and here sat a beer flat full of photographs. And it come to find out that the old boy who served as a conductor out here when they shot the movie had retired in Spokane, and at some point there'd been an estate sale, and here were all of his photographs, including pictures he'd taken of shooting Timberjack, and then some of the lobby shots were in the collection as well, probably 30 to 40 photographs altogether in this bunch of beer flats. So guess what? They're mine. This is the one we've all seen. This was the publicity still that was made into a postcard and dished up on a lot of movie posters around the country, with all the stars up there on the walkway. They've very carefully in this put on the Milwaukee Road banners, which weren't in the movie, if you notice. It was just number 17. But then the crew shot their own picture. And here's the picture that old Walter Miller shot of the crew, the Milwaukee crew that helped them out with number 7 behind them, the Willamette, during the shooting of that film. And then this is the engine crew over here. And you guys probably know all those names. And here's a picture that Miller took up at Gold Creek, across from McNamara's, Belmont Creek, thank you. But that is McNamara's Landing down there, right? And the old shops are right over there? Nope. Are we higher up the river than that?
Belmont Water Tower just out of sight behind them log cars.
All right. Okay.
They had quite a filming at Belmont.
Okay, I told you I don't know about all this. But anyway, you can see all the people there that are getting ready to make the shoot as they do their action scene up there. Here's another picture holding up the big reflector so they get the right light on the stars up there in the cab of the locomotive doing their thing. And here's a couple of resulting publicity stills that were shot up there that served as lobby cards when the movie came out in '56.
That bottom picture is at McNamara's with the hand car.
Right. The big fight? Yeah. Right, okay.
I stopped it.
You stopped it? How'd you do that?
I was just a little kid, my brother and I went running out there and right in the middle of that scene. That's true. And then they had to start over. I got yelled at that time.
And you're still being yelled at,
Yeah, Mom and my folks and everybody took us out there to watch that, and I don't know what we did. Mom always said we got out there far enough where they had to cut.
Well, you know, we'll come back to this in just a minute. All right, I'll take a stab at this. This is probably right here at Clearwater Yard somewhere with a mountain behind us here at Bonner, right?
No, that's right here at Milton.
Yeah, I think it is. Because they had a lot of folks out there watching the filming of this, including some school groups. Some of you probably can find yourselves in there if you've been in Bonner since 1955. And here's the scary part. I was looking at this photograph and I'm thinking, well, yeah, those kids are what, 7 to 9 years old? Let me think. Oh, my God, that's the same age I am. I was born in 46. I was 9 in 55. So some of you who are in your mid-60s probably can find yourself in this photograph. Are you one? All right, we got to see it. Come on up here. Oh, you're not in the, okay. I have to believe this is a group of Bonner School kids, I would guess, what, 3rd, 4th grade maybe, who've come out to watch the filming of this movie. Look at the expressions on the faces. Are we having fun? Look at this little gal over here. Now, I'm a retired school teacher. I can read kids' expressions. These kids are not having fun. Somebody's just yelled at them for doing something. They've probably said, everybody up on the hill, and I don't want you doing that ever again, right? I bet these two people back here, which is probably the teacher and the administrator, have had a hand in that. And this is the resulting fun time everybody had looking at them shoot the movie today.
There's lots of waiting when you're watching a movie theater.
Yes, yes. But anyway, it would be interesting, Dennis, to hang that picture up and have people see if they can find themselves in it.
Yeah, that would be.
Because they're around, you know they are. I just threw this one in. They, for a while, ran ski trains up to Blanchard Creek on the branch up here. They would haul skiers up there. I think this is in the 30s. And they would ski up there. There was another little ski area years ago there at below Potomac on the hillside. Okay. Anybody ever make this trip? Don't know much of the context, but somebody snapped a photograph and it's mine now. Here's some much later photographs. Old Dwight Rittenhouse, who is a retired Milwaukee hogger, gave me these. He worked for many years switching in the Milwaukee switcher out here at the mill. And I put these in just because until about, 82, they ran the Thompson Fall logger down here. And they would run it around on the riverside on a big loop track, and they'd unload all those log cars from Thompson Falls down here at Bonner, so it is railroad related. And here's a couple of other pictures of the equipment that are working out there. And so I'm going to say this is in the early 80s. And those of you who know...
That Wagner in that picture is the very first Wagner that Bonner bought. They had it in Bonner when they bought it. The next size up, that one went to Thompson Falls.
This one over here is interesting. I think it's a little earlier. I'm going to guess that's probably out of the 70s because of the collection it was in. Those are mine stalls. Those are mining timbers loaded up on that flat car, probably bound for Butte, for the ACM mines in Butte, the underground mines, before Berkeley Pit. Well, now we can deal with some survivors. Up on the left is number 5. on the turntable in Missoula. This one's interesting for a lot of reasons, not only because of number 5, but number 5 has been sold at this point, and it's on its way to Great Falls. A gentleman by the name of Jack Hoover had bought it, and he was an interesting guy who had connections. Well, to put it briefly, his father was the last president of Anaconda Company. And so, miraculously, NP and GN agreed to move this Shay to Great Falls for him, free of charge. And it sat for years at Memke's Steam Museum out there east of Great Falls on the way to Belt. And it's been sold again, and it now is in Williams, Arizona on the Grand Canyon Railroad, and they have some hopes of restoring it, but it still exists. This photograph is also interesting because it comes out of the R.V. Nixon collection, but there's Ron standing there, so who took it? Wasn't Ron. Ron did a lot of work with a guy by the name of Bamford Dodge, and so this is, I suspect, one of Dodge's photographs, and he's up on the roof of the roundhouse because he was a chief mechanic at the roundhouse and had access to it. And what I find interesting is that they're tearing down the first third of the west side of the roundhouse in 1961. This is the roundhouse that was built in 1923. And then over here, out of the same collection, is number 7, the Willamette that's out at Fort Missoula now, sort of sitting there neglected in the back lot here at the ACM mill, all covered with snow and rusty. And when did they move it over into the park over here, where the old, in what? 62. So this is just before it moved then, when it's up there. And then it sat here until RailLink moved it into where it sits now. So those are survivors. And that brings me kind of to the end of what I want to do this morning, or afternoon, but I want to show you this picture again, because that's exactly the same location as this picture. And I always like to deal with beginnings and endings. So we have the Milwaukee arriving in Missoula, and that was some of the first rail to be torn out in 1980 in exactly the same location. It's kind of bracketing 71 years of history here around Bonner and Missoula. So, thank you. Any questions? I've seen that written somewhere, Bob. Clearwater Yard, am I the only one that's seen that?
Yeah. I never heard it.
Okay, well, I might have it wrong. I warned you. I warned you.
But, Bill,
Yes.
they tied up the engine over there at some time, at least before World War II.
Well, the old engine house survived a long time. I remember the old engine house sitting out there, pretty derelict, and here about 10 years ago, when the EPA business started, they came in there and they found out that underneath that old engine house was the old grease pits. And so there was a cleanup effort to clean up those old grease pits. So evidence of it survived up until 2000. And one of my acquaintances worked on that crew. And down in the bottom of the old well was this old Stilson wrench. It says on the side of it here, CMNSTPRY. Someone either dropped it or threw it into the tank, and nobody was going to go after it, that's for sure. And so he brought it to work one day and said, here, he says, you like railroad stuff, here you can have it, and told me the story. And it's sort of sat around in my basement now for about 10 years. But since it does have a Bonner connection, I'm going to give it to Dennis as part of their collection here. And Dennis can either use it as a boat anchor or for something really big.
I've got another one at home, you want it?
It says Milwaukee on it.
NP.
NPRY. What, Dad used to tell me they used to go sit in that engine and smoke, hit lunch. You couldn't smoke on there. And for a lot of years, and I don't know whatever came of it, when Dad died, Dad had the water glass off this number 7. He took it. He borrowed it. And I lost it. I think I got yelled at again. No, I can remember in Dad's wood shop, that water glass off the back end of that steam engine, it was about so long and so wide and real thick corrugated glass, like a steam pressure water glass. And when we moved the house or went through the house after he passed away, I never could find it. So I don't know whether it's still tucked away somewhere out there and somebody in the future might find it, but anyway, I was always hoping I could find it, so it'd just be kind of neat to have, yeah.
Or just did they replace it?
I don't know whether they ever did or not.
So number 5, when it got sold and went to Great Falls, was missing linkage.
Yeah, but this was off the number 7.
Right.
The one that's in the
They had robbed linkage off of number 5 for something, to do something else, and when Jack bought it, they gave him some other linkage, which didn't ever fit. Jack always tried to find the correct linkage to put on it because he had dreams of steaming it up again. Apparently it was in pretty good shape. And now the story out of Arizona is that they have found the correct linkage for it that came in from Cass Scenic, and they are going to steam it up again. So we might see another ACM engine run in live steam at some point. So they go on. I also, out of Jack's stuff, have his collection of Shea stuff. He was given a lot of the paperwork when he got number 5, including the operator's manuals and parts lists and some company correspondence where they tried to order parts for it and things. I've showed those to Dennis, and Dennis will probably end up with them at some point.
On number 7, the Willamette, all of the water glass mechanism, all the clamps are still there in the cab. The only thing that's not there is the glass itself. But the housing, the clamps, they're all there.
Well, the glass is somewhere at Piltsville.
Yeah.
That's all I can tell. Somewhere in the old Bateman house at Piltsville, there's glass for that in.
I have a question for Bob. I have been meaning to ask you about this, having to do with Tunnel 16 and a half. Before they closed it down for the EPA cleanup, I used to run and ride my bike through there quite a bit. They're probably like a lot of tunnels, there's all kinds of street art that decorates the tunnel now and is the last 20 years, but on this end of it, on the east end of it, a lot of people used to etch their names and initials in the tunnel, and it's almost like a litany of Bonner families that are all up and down the tunnel, including there's a Bob Bateman, and I believe the
LF, Linda Felton. I sit on Felton, he's sitting right over here. She was my first girlfriend in grade school.
And this was actually etched somehow. How did you do
We
that?
just found a spike and then a rock and then just worked it around.
Okay, and I think you put the year on it.
Yeah, I don't remember. That probably would have been, well, it would have been grade school, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, probably 6th or 7th grade out here. Because we used to take first it was bicycles, and then it was our little motor scooters. We come from Piltsville, and then, of course, the truck stop wasn't there then. We come across there, and then the old double track MP bridge that was then single track had ties all the way across it. So we crossed that. I did it once in my Jeep, but anyway, we crossed that, and then we'd go over, hop the NP, and then go over, and this is one of the dumbest things, but everybody in Piltsville did it, and Don can attest to this. We'd either take our bicycles or walk, or our motor scooters, and we'd go right down the middle of the Milwaukee tracks through that tunnel. And then we'd go over there in the summer and go swimming at Tunnel Lake. And then when we got done, we'd go the other way. We'd come out of there and go down and then cross the duck bridge and then go back to Piltsville. But everybody, there's a big heart up there. It says BB plus LF. That's just one. But everybody in Bonner, for years and years, you'd go over there and put your initials, or you and your girlfriend's initials, or whatever it would be. You'd carve them in the side of the tunnel side. But now I think, isn't that all painted over with all graffiti and stuff?
Some of it is, a lot of it
Yeah.
is, but you can still see yours, and I don't know if you know this, but right below yours, I think it says, Bob Bateman, 1953 maybe, or 55.
No, I was born in 49, I was really young. It had been 60 something.
Oh, okay. But right below it now, it says Tom Bateman,
Yeah, that's my son.
1983.
Well, when he was, I took him over there, well, the tracks were gone. So this would have been, Bill, when was that dirt road over there, about 81 or so?
Yeah, they tore the tracks up in 81 though.
Tom was, I don't know, 5 or 6 years old or something like that. So we drove him over there and walked him through the tunnel because there wasn't any tracks there then. And we found a spike in the rock and we chiseled his name in there too. So that's why that's there.
Jim, if you look harder, you'll find a lot of university students' names in that tunnel too. I know there's at least one.
It was always scary to go through that tunnel.
There's two
Well,
sets.
you'd look down there to the west and you could see a signal. And we were smart enough to know if that signal was green, well, there wasn't anything coming. But we weren't smart enough to realize that something could be coming from the east. Coming against that green signal, that green signal. So I don't know, nobody ever got zinged or hit or something. That tunnel had 3 or 4 indentations on the inside of the curve, where if something came along, you could step up and stand in there, so the train wouldn't get you. You know that.
Well, we have one other thing here. We have the Big Blackfoot Railway book, which is out of print and basically non-existent, but we did have a spare copy, and we have had the author, Bob Bateman, autograph for a book, and we're donating this to the Bonner Milltown History Center.
Well, we thought about it. I took it down a couple places, a couple printers, and they said it's cost prohibitive. It's not. You'd have to make so many of them, you'd never sell them all. You'd have to make somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 of them to make it. When we made that book sold for $4.95, and I made $1.50, I think, off every copy. And now it costs over $25-30 just to do something that big. So you'd have to sell it for, $20, and there's nobody going to buy it. When I first sold it, I got one back with a nasty letter. The lady told me that $4.95 is way too much for that skinny little book. So I sent it back to her and told her she could keep it for free.
I do have an order blank for ordering his book from when he was living in Three Forks. I think it was $4.95. You can order there.
I sold a lot of them. We sold 2,000, and then we had to have another 1,000 made, so we sold 3,000.
Isn't it 2 editions? Isn't there a first?
Yeah, there's a first edition.
These are all first edition.
And the picture on the front is from Dyke Rittenhouse's collection. And then there's a second one that shows after the Blackfoot line was abandoned in '77. Shows some pictures of the right-of-way gone and stuff.
Yeah, you got a picture in your second edition at Twin Creeks, where
Yeah.
we dozed the railroad grade out and put the chain link fence in.
Yeah.
My wife has a little story she wants to tell. Here, a little advertisement. Here.
If any of you guys are interested in experiencing a railroad trip, what it was like in the Milwaukee era, Milwaukee built a huge, over $26 million in 5 years to build tunnels and trestles over the Montana-Idaho border. And it's now called the Hiawatha Trail. You can go through these tunnels. One is as long as 1.7 miles. And you can bring your own bicycles, your own helmets, and lights. Or you can rent them at the Lookout Ski Area at the top of the pass. Then you can also buy meals there if you want. You can also, take the shuttle. But it's downhill. In other words, you don't have to. But you can take your bike down this 15 miles through tunnels and trestles is like nothing else. And I'll show you a little about the brochure. But if you want to experience trestles and tunnels and a unique experience through 15 miles of the old railroad that Milwaukee had, call and make your reservations or things like that through the Lookout ski area. Thank you.
You can also drive the lower part of it between Pearson and Avery. You get through 2 or 3 tunnels and 2 or 3 of the trestles.
Yes, and that was Mac Palmer. He has some books on the Milwaukee for sale, a couple of them left at a discount. So you can see Mac Palmer if you'd like to buy some of those early Milwaukee Road books. And also in passing, did you guys hear that they're changing the Super Bowl location next year? You know, the problems that they had, they decided, we're not going to do that. We're going to have it at the Motel 6. You know why? Because Motel 6 keeps the light on for you.
That was bad.
That comes from the lady whose Motel 6 was Motel 6 of the year for the United States out of 400 or 500 and some motels. Anybody have any questions or anything they'd like to add while we're doing this?
I have a question about Milwaukee. My uncle was a master electrician down in the Bozeman and Three Forks area, Manhattan. I just wonder if anybody knows anything about the master electricians down there.
What was his name?
Paul Simmer.
Jim, you know anything? I don't remember don't know the name or anything. He used to work that job.
Yeah. And then some of my other relations, Burdett's.
Yeah, I know the Burdett's. I went to school with Terry Burnett. He's a signal maintainer over at Hope.
My cousin.
Clarksville. Yeah.
Oh, that's right. I forget that.
Yeah.
Okay, just wanted to know.
Anybody wants to actually get inside the cab of the Willamette out at Fort Missoula, get hold of me. I have the keys to it, and I can open it up and take people into the cab of that locomotive anytime that it's mutually agreeable as far as schedule is concerned.
Another thing on that, what's called that, we live out in Clinton, and when the Milwaukee come through there, we had a dog whose name was Rufus. And we knew when they was coming through because Rufus would go out there and bark at it. I said, I hope you don't bring one home. So.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I could add a little story about mixing airplanes with logging trains. And I used to fly in 56 and 57. I flew air patrol for the Forest Service out of Missoula on the Lolo Forest. And that involved flying in a little Cessna 180 airplane and going around all over and spotting forest fires and calling them in. We had a radio in the airplane, and we'd make this trip, numerous times up the Blackfoot into Seeley Lake and around. And then we used to, in the spring, we'd work with a lot of different cooperators. And of course, one of them was Les Talbot out here, who ran the Blackfoot Forest Protective Association, and they protected all the forest land, Anaconda Company forest lands. And so they had one of our radios, so when I found a fire on their lands, I could call and talk to them. So one day, I think this had to be about August 1957, and I was headed out to Missoula, and I see a smoke up here on the Milwaukee track, the log railroad, on up between Bonner and McNamara Landing up there, and so I you know, when you go to find a smoke, you got to fly around it for a while you get your bearings and get the location. So I got that located, and I called that one in down to Les. And no more than got that done, and I could see another one right up the tracks a ways. So I go up and do the same thing, and I fly around there and give him that location. And then a little while later, here's a third one on up the tracks. And so I got that far with Les, and he says, hey, can you just leave that fire go and go see if you can stop that train up there? He says that train's got a hot box or something like that, and it's dropping hot metal, and it's starting these fires, and if you could stop that train. So, well, I happen to be flying with an old Johnson pilot out here, a guy by the name of Gil Musgrove, and he was an old World War II bomber, fighter pilot. And so I talked it over with him, and he said, "Do you think we could stop that?" And that was just right up his alley, man. Just what he wanted to do. And so we got up there, and the train was just coming into, I think it was into that McNamara landing flat up there. And he come down there, and we were in this airplane, and I thought the wheels of the plane were going to hit the top of the cab of that thing, and he just zoomed right over it there, and he waggling his wings, you know, like this, you know. And we go up and we go around, and he's doing it again, you know, and we just right over the top of that engine, you know. And about the third time we did that, well, finally he stopped. The train stopped there. And so I had one of these, well, we used to call them a streamer message thing. And I wrote a little note in there about him setting fires, and could drop the streamer, and it was a little envelope thing with a bunch of orange crepe paper on it, and you had to get, you had to know what you're doing in order to get that pretty close to the train. I'd done a lot of that because I used to drop newspapers to all the lookouts and all that kind of thing along the way. But so here we go, and we come right down there, and Gil says, "Let her go," and I did. And you open up the window of the airplane and you throw that out, and we got it there, right, just a few yards ahead of the train, and just a little bit off the side. And as we pulled up away, we could see it, and here come the engineer out of the train. He run down there and got the message, and he waved it like this, you know. So we wiggled our wings at him, and away we went. But just a little tale.
That's pretty cool. Sort of like a strafing mission. Sort of like a daylight on the east side of the mountain. Sort of like a daylight on the east side of the mountain. Yeah. Somebody I know is the engineer.
Oh, anybody have any more questions or any suggestions? Anything else? Willie.
Well, I don't think there was anything mentioned about any wrecks on there, but, well, of course, I went to school here at Bonner, but I grew up the line up here at Tura, and we lived at the old Joe Terrio place for quite a while. And also lived in a section house right there at Tura. But my dad was an engineer for a long time for the Northern Pacific. Well, I think it was about 1938 or 39, we heard of an engine blowing up here at Ravenna. And I believe there are some pictures of that too. Well, anyway, my dad heard about that engine blowing up, and he made the remark, well, he says, old Ernie made his last run. And the engineer's name was Ernie Weston. And when he went out through the tunnel up there at Ravenna, there was a low spot in the tracks. And this Ernie Weston was what they call a water hog. Dad said he fired for him for quite a number of runs, and he had the belief that the lower the water, the hotter the steam. Well, when he went out and hit that low spot, all the water run to the head end of the engine in the boiler, and then when they come out of that low spot, it come back onto the crown sheet. It created too much steam and blew up. And Anyway, they found the headlight out in the Wills hayfield there, about 300 yards out in the hayfield. And then again, and I think Bob showed me a picture here a while back. I thought it was in the summertime, but up here at Truro on the highway, when they were cutting down the old Truro Hill, and there was a train come down, and they used to set these torpedoes on the rails up above as warning. And if I got this right, I think 1 was for caution, and 2 was for slow, and 3 was for stop. Well, they'd made a shot over on the hill, and they had some big rock that had come down on the railroad tracks. So they moved this big Beside series shovel down there to clear the rocks. Well, this train come through, and the watchman up there didn't set his torpedoes up the line up there far enough. And this other young fella and I were real good friends, Billy Walker and I. We was over there on the railroad track watching this shovel over there clear the big boulders off the tracks. Well, we heard the torpedoes and everything and looked up the line, and this train was well on his way yet. So about that time he hit the shovel. Well, that's when Walker and I went over the bank, headed for the riverbank. And then again over at Thelma, there used to be a siding right across from where I lived there. And they had a wreck there in 1939, I believe it was. And what had happened, it burned off a journal off of one of the cars, and it went in the ditch and scattered. And one other time I was coming back off the trap line, and the snow was deep, coming down from Allen Creek, and I got the snowshoes off, walked down the railroad track, and decided to take a shortcut for home. So I went up the bank, heard this train coming over on the Milwaukee, and this was 1949, winter of 49. I just got up on the bank, put the snowshoes back on, and started for home. I heard some noise behind me. I turned around and looked, and there was boxcars and everything else going end over end. If I'd have stayed on the track, well, I'd have been ground up right in the middle of it. But they had 2 wrecks there right at Thelma. There was a siding on there. And I've thought of that later on, that a lot of times walking down the railroad tracks, you hear a train coming, you just stepped over on the other side and let it go by. But this time I took a shortcut for home. So that's why I'm still here.
Where is Thelma? Where is Thelma?
Thelma is, well, what we used to call Thelma Flats. It's right up here at Truro after you cross the bridge and go up, and then you cross the old Milwaukee right-of-way. Well, there was a siding right in there. I got a 1939 map that shows it on there as by that name, Thelma. So actually I live at Thelma Flats instead of Truro.
We never did find out who Thelma was, though, did we? We never did find out who Thelma was, why it was named Thelma.
No, never did.
Well, we have coffee and cookies and goodies back there, and we have some pieces on display there, and anybody have questions about any of this stuff, we're willing to answer them questions. There's photographs of the 700 steam train in 44-49, which Mr. Bateman was a part of that crew. So any questions, you're welcome to have at it.